5 minutes off of the clock.
Yeah.
After he says stop.
You're
really going to test me with this. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for everyone who stayed. You guys are sticking around for a good talk, I think. But anyway, so I'm glad to be here to share some of the research that I've been doing, looking at the dependence of aspen on redistributed snow, and then looking at how it's going to change over the next few decades as temperatures increase. Let's see. So usually I like to spend a little bit more time prefacing this talk about large changes in precipitation regimes that we're seeing across the Intermountain West, but they did such a good job of it this morning. I think I'm going to kind of bypass some of that. But anyway, I like to show this figure when I'm talking about my research because precipitation phase, whether it occurs in the form of rain or snow, is kind of the impetus behind some of the research that I do. So this is a figure from Klaus et al. In 2014 that shows probability of precipitation occurring as snow under historic conditions and then under mid-century conditions. And what we see is as temperatures increase, fairly dramatic reductions in winter degree temperatures conducive to snowfall. And so my research is interested in how does the shift in precipitation influence vegetation communities. And so it's a complicated question to get at because there's a lot of uncertainties that still remain. Throughout much of this area, these changes are occurring in complex terrain where we have a lot of mountainous regions where gradients are shifting simultaneously. So being able to predict the response of vegetation to this can be difficult. And we're still not really sure how shifts from a snow-dominated precipitation regime to one that's dominated by rain will influence soil moisture. We expect that in regions that were historically dominated by snowfall, where you have the physical redistribution of snow across the landscape, as temperatures increase, it will become more uniform as rain falls and doesn't get blown around like snow does. And so we're really left at a disadvantage as scientists to really understand how these vegetation communities will respond at fine scales. And so as a scientist, I hope to use my research to better inform managers and give them tools about important processes that they can use to identify vulnerable areas or species. And so the system where I work is shown here. This picture shows aspen stands that lie on leeward sides of slopes where every winter large snowdrifts form as a result of wind. And you can see that in this LiDAR image where in dark purple we have drift zones where majority of the effective precipitation is held. And then directly below that we see areas of productive vegetation, in this case aspen communities. And so based on this fairly striking visible relationship between the distribution of soil moisture and snowpack and then vegetation, we can begin to develop some hypotheses. First one being that the redistribution of snow prolongs the period of plant available moisture and provides a sort of soil moisture subsidy later into the growing season, where typically there's a pronounced drought period, at least in the Owyhees. And then at the same time, as climate conditions change and temperatures increase, this loss of a snowdrift will result in decreased ecosystem function. Photosynthetic rates aren't going to be able to continue at rates that they historically have been able to as a result of an increased growing season and decreased soil moisture. So introducing you to my study system a little bit more thoroughly, it's the Reynolds Creek Experimental Watershed and Critical Zone Observatory. It's a really good spot to be doing this kind of research because it's been very instrumented over the course of over 40 years, I think now. And with those measurements, they've actually detected shifts in precipitation phase over the past 40 years, where at lower and mid elevations we see an increase in the proportion of rain to snow. So it is actively becoming a watershed that is experiencing these changes that we might see throughout much of the West. So the results that I'm going to be sharing with you today are 3 aspen stands simulated in the upper reaches of the watershed. There's 2 mid-elevation sites, Johnston Draw and Sheep Creek, which receives the lowest amount of annual precipitation, and Johnston Draw receives about median amounts. And then a single high elevation wet site that receives quite a bit more precipitation. And each of these aspen stands lies below a single snowdrift that forms every year and provides the majority of the soil moisture that is used during the growing season. So quickly go over some of the methods of my model simulation. So I parameterized the biogeochemical process model, BiomeBGC, for aspen. I did that by selecting species-specific values and then measuring sensitive parameter values such as carbon and nitrogen ratios of leaves and roots, and then specific leaf area. And these initial simulations assumed a uniform precipitation layer. So to account for the drifting of snow, I used ice snowball simulated output. And in the Reynolds Creek watershed, it's been used extensively, and my stands are located either within or very close to catchments that have been, that have previous ice snowball simulations. And so basically, using simulated values of peak SWE within the drift zone divided by the total measured uniform precipitation across the drift period, I calculated drift factors, which I then reapplied to precipitation data used in BiomeBGC. And essentially all that did was create a simulated drift that was representative of what we saw at each site. So once I had simulations under historic conditions, assuming, or after accounting for the redistribution of snow, I began to incorporate climate change conditions. And I did this for mid-century projections under a high CO2 emissions pathway. And basically what I did was I calculated the average monthly temperature increase from downscale projections from the MACA data set and averaged all the temperature increases for the 20 GCMs available at that data portal. And then I also kept precipitation the same, since over the course of their measurement period in Reynolds Creek, they haven't detected a significant change in the amount of annual precipitation, either positive or negative. And so diving into some of the results really quickly, here we have annual precipitation for each site, and you can see that the effects of redistribution of snow varies by site, with Sheep Creek existing under the largest drift. And you can see that the effect of precipitation is increased fairly dramatically, and it decreases by mid-century too, which is outlined in red. And then for the two mid-century sites, I've also included mid-century conditions assuming a uniform precipitation layer. And that's simply ignoring any topographical effects on the redistribution of precipitation. So they're essentially existing on a flat plane. So there's no drift to subsidize them. Briefly touching on this is a comparison of the last day of snowpack simulated by BiomeBGC and ice snowball. And the take-home point here is that there was some disagreement between BiomeBGC and ice snowball, but there wasn't an apparent bias in either over or under prediction. So given the simplicity of the snowmelt model within BiomeBGC, we decided to go with it as is and apply the climate change scenarios. Before I get into some of the specifics around ecosystem processes and carbon fluxes, I'd like to kind of introduce the concept of net primary production a little bit better. I think you guys might have a pretty good grasp on it. But anyway, so NPP is essentially the rate of carbon accumulation minus respiration costs, and this varies over the course of the year. So looking at daily simulations at Sheep Creek, we can kind of look at how it varies by season, where in winter months, aspen is a deciduous species, and during this time it's limited by temperature, incoming radiation, and it's largely dormant because it doesn't have a canopy. However, as we transition into spring conditions, temperatures increase, snowmelt is occurring, soil moisture is non-limiting, and conditions are favorable for canopy development and leaf flush. And you can see that represented by the ramping of net primary production. Transitioning into the summer season, which in Reynolds Creek is typically a time of pronounced drought. They don't get a lot of their precipitation during these months. And as a result, you see continued photosynthesis within each stand. However, the utilization of available soil moisture soon becomes limiting, and you see that as soil moisture is depleted, we see decreases in net primary production. And this year in particular, it was actually enough to result in negative net primary production for a fairly extended period. Then moving on into autumn, we see increasing precipitation events. However, other environmental factors are becoming limiting. Temperatures are becoming colder, daylight is becoming limiting, and it ultimately results in rapid canopy senescence. So given the spectrum of production across the year, we can begin to look at certain processes that might be influenced by climate change. First, we can look at reductions in snowpack and see how that relates to springtime conditions, warmer springtime conditions, and then potential advances in leaf flush and extended growing season. We can look at conditions that occur across the summer months and see how that limits photosynthesis. And then we can ultimately relate that to the timing and magnitude of drought stress that each stand experiences. So to look at some of the site-specific results, I'm going to first take you to Sheep Creek, where we saw the most dramatic drought stress impacts. This is annual net primary production plotted across the entire simulation period, where in blue we have historic conditions, in red we have mid-century projections, and then in black we have mid-century net primary production assuming a uniform precipitation. You can see that there's quite a bit of interannual variability, and it's particularly interesting for this site. So to kind of get at the details of what processes might be important, we can look at simulations of daily data and first look at snow water. And for this year, after applying the temperature increase, we see that final day of snowpack presence is, it occurs approximately 30 days earlier. And on top of that, we see approximately an 80% reduction in snow water for the year, indicating that this site has pretty much transitioned to a rain-dominated precipitation regime. We then look at simulations of net primary production, and we can see that with warmer spring conditions and decreased snowpack, we have an earlier leaf flush by about 14 days. And that couples with an approximately 30-day period of extended negative NPP where soil moisture is limiting. And across the growing season, we also see that daily rates of net primary production are reduced as a result of increased evaporative demand. We saw similar results at the other mid-elevation site, Johnston Draw. However, across the simulation period, we didn't see nearly as much interannual variability. We didn't see the kind of peaks and valleys that we did at Sheep Creek. And it's likely because this site receives more precipitation, but it also persists under a drift that's a lot smaller. But again, if we look at simulations of snow water, we see that, again, significant reductions by mid-century. If there's any snow at all, it's often transitory. What does 2 mean again?
You have 2 minutes and then
Plus
5 minutes of questions and answers, or you can
Okay,
just keep
okay,
going.
okay. I think I got it. 13. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so where was I? Yeah, significant reductions in snowpack, and what little snow there is often is transitory and quickly melts. Again, transitioning into our simulations of daily NPP, we can see that, like Sheep Creek, there is an increase in growing season length by about 14 days. However, net primary production doesn't become soil moisture limited to the point where it becomes negative. However, we do see daily rates that are reduced from historic conditions. And then finally, looking at our results for Reynolds Mountain East, we can see that after incorporating temperature increases, we actually see slight increases in net primary production. I'm actually going pretty fast through it, but anyway, I'm going to talk to you specifically about 2011, just to highlight a year where we see differences in historic and projected conditions. And by looking at that, we see that it has an increased growing season with decreased snowpack and more favorable spring conditions, but daily rates of net primary production aren't limiting, so it can continue historic rates of productivity across the entire growing season. And so I'd like to wrap up this talk by touching on a few key points. The first one being that with our simulations of historic net primary production, we found that our simulations were improved. by accounting for the redistribution of snow, indicating that this process is pretty important in this system. And if you are trying to get at potential vulnerability, you might want to incorporate it into any model simulations that you do, although it would probably depend on size as well, or spatial scale as well. One thing in common from all the sites that we found was that we did see an advance in spring phenology. On average, leaf flush occurred about 14 days earlier at each site. But other than that, we saw that the climate change impacts were variable across these sites within a fairly small watershed, which was pretty interesting. And it kind of complicates the manager's job of identifying vulnerable species and regions, and then enacting management strategies. So yeah, knowing that net primary production can be influenced by these different variables, it's important to convey this information to land managers so that they can at least address this complexity and not make decisions that are potentially oversimplifications of natural processes. So knowing that topography and its effects on drifting snow, growing season conditions either in the spring or the summer, and total annual precipitation can all play a role in net primary production, even under increased temperatures. So with that, I would like to acknowledge the Kavanaugh Lab, all the graduate students that I've worked with and have supported me through all this, the Boise ARS and Reynolds Creek Field Support, and then finally the funding for this research was made possible by the Northwest Climate Science Center. So I think I've got plenty of time for questions, maybe.
3 minutes, so two questions.
Okay, cool. 2 minutes. Anyone? Bueller? Yeah?
So, I'm a fisheries ecologist, and it seems to me that these watersheds, or these sites you're working on, are headwaters.
Okay.
Is that correct? Is that usually
maybe
you see aspen in along stream channels?
Yeah, these are not riparian stands.
These are not riparian.
Yeah, so we selected them because they were located below a single snowdrift, and they're fairly high up on ridge slopes, so that relationship is fairly direct. Although there is riparian aspen in Reynolds Creek,
So,
but
so would you expect to see the same thing happen with that riparian associated, where their feet may be
Yeah.
a little wetter?
I would expect to see them. I would expect to see a dependence on winter precipitation, and the timing of which is obviously important, but it gets more complicated depending on how many drifts feed them. And I guess I haven't really considered the riparian aspen in this study, but yeah, I would think there would be an influence, although more complicated.
Okay.
Yes.
The riparian aspen collects snow just like a drift.
Okay.
So the snow's about 3 times as deep in the aspen grove
Oh, in
around
the valleys.
than it is outside of those. So it's the same feature. It's just a different mechanism that captures the snow. But the fact that the aspen are there reduces the wind speed and makes it a deposition zone instead of a scar zone.
Okay. Yes.
So you mentioned drifts and the size of the drift being a factor of how climate change could affect net primary productivity. So would you suggest drifts as a way for managers to know where to worry about where aspen can be vulnerable, as a way to kind of map maybe aspen vulnerability?
It really depends. I mean, soil moisture storage plays a big role in this too. So, and then also net precipitation. Like we see at Johnston Draw, it exists under a somewhat smaller drift, but the total annual precipitation appears to be enough to allow it to continue and maintain positive rates of net primary production across the growing season. So, I guess like the main take home with this is, you have to consider drifts in addition to multiple other variables as well to get at what sites are going to be variable. Does that answer your question? Good.